Hello, I'm Kate Jones. I'm a history teacher and head of history at the British school Al Khabairat in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. But I'm originally from the UK and I'm returning to the UK at the end of this year, which I'm very excited about. So as we go back to school, I thought I would share a presentation I've created about the overview of formative assessment. Now, formative assessment strategies are something that I've been using throughout my career, but I have been reading and writing a lot about 5 specific formative assessment strategies recently, because my next book, published 13th of September, is this part of the In Action series, 5 formative assessment strategies in action. And as you can see, there's a great collection with more books on the way. And this series began with Tom Sherrington and his hugely successful and popular book, Rosenshine's Principles in Action, where Tom took the work of Baruch Rosenshine and then wrote about how teachers could use it in action in the classroom. And that has proved to be very helpful, as I said, hugely popular with teachers around the world. So what I've done, as the other In Action authors have, is I focused on a specific piece of work, an area research, and that is the work of Wiliam and Siobhan Leahy. And they wrote about 5 formative assessment strategies, and then I have taken that and said how I use it in my classroom and offered lots of advice and tips. And I do want to share this because I can't believe I'm part of this team. Pinch myself. But I do feel like this book has been a team effort, because I contacted Wiliam to tell him that I would be doing this book, and he was so helpful and kind. He thoroughly edited this book, giving me lots of feedback, which has just helped me so much as a classroom teacher and boosted my confidence. This book is part of the Walkthroughs production, led by the wonderful Tom Sherrington and Oliver Caviglioli. This is Siobhan Leahy, who co-authored books with Wiliam about the 5 formative assessment strategies. And finally, oh wow, the wonderful Professor John Hattie wrote the foreword for this book. The foreword is brilliant. I think it's about 4 pages long, and it's so good because he writes about formative assessment. He writes about the different strategies. I loved that. I mean, obviously I loved John Hattie writing the foreword for my book, but it's really good what he has written too. So let's get to formative assessment. And I think a good starting point, and I apologize, you probably already know what I mean when I say formative assessment, but just for clarification, and in case we have any NQTs, trainees, early careers teachers, it's useful to have this conversation. What is formative assessment? Now, there's lots of definitions out there, but this is how I have explained it simply. It's a range of evidence-informed strategies that we use in the classroom to support our students. However, it's not just with a focus for the teachers supporting students, it's also for the students themselves to understand what they are learning, what they need to do, how they can improve. Now, I have written the book for teachers, but I'm very aware that these 5 strategies are for the teacher, the learner, and the peer. And another really important point to make about formative assessment is it's ongoing. It's taking place during the learning process, which many people refer to as assessment for learning, responsive teaching. So whilst there's a lot of formative assessment that we can focus on in our planning, there are some aspects that we perhaps can't plan and prepare, because that's what happens in the classroom. Misconceptions arise. Sometimes concepts take longer to teach than we perhaps initially expected. So it is ongoing to just constantly keep the learning moving forward, which is different to summative assessment, and this is important to know. So summative assessment certainly has a place in education. Of course it does. I mean, we've seen what's happened with the teacher assessed grades and all the challenges we faced, and that has been a type of summative assessment. They tend to be high stakes, very formal, an evaluation at the end of the learning process. So actually, if you do think about your normal GCSEs and A-levels, once a student has sat that exam, then they don't do anything until they get their grade, because it is that evaluation. They can take the option to resit, but we know most don't. So hence the high stakes nature of it. So hopefully everyone's got that understanding of how formative assessment differs from summative assessment. And I also think it's important to give Shirley Clarke a shout out. Now, she's referenced in my book. She's inspired the work of Dylan, Wiliam and Siobhan Leahy. She's worked with John Hattie. Now, this book was published before I even started teaching in 2005. And I do like to revisit books from years ago. I got this from my school CPD library, actually, and it is really interesting, because the reason why I like to revisit older books, and some people might argue, well, that's not helpful, they're outdated, but I usually find three things. First of all, there can still be things I can learn from books published years ago. There might be a lot of content that I'm already very familiar with, but it's quite useful to see how some strategies have stood the test of time and why they're effective and we're still using them. And then also it is interesting to see how the profession has moved on and how it's changed. I recently revisited Daisy Christodoulou, 7 Myths, a superb book. Now, some people argued that that book was out of date because Daisy Christodoulou was writing about Ofsted before the Ofsted reforms in 2019, but nevertheless, I still found it a fascinating, interesting read that I could take things from, but that's just me. So what does Shirley Clarke have to say about formative assessment? I wanted to share this specific quote because I like this point about how we're continually refining these strategies. They are evolving and developing over time. And I think that's quite central to my In Action book, has been about looking at these strategies, how I have used them, adapted them, evolving and developing. There's quite a lot of references to technology in the book. Obviously, we've had online learning, we have online tools in the classroom, which wouldn't have been mainstream when Shirley Clarke was writing in 2005. So I definitely think formative assessment has moved forward a lot. So what are these 5 strategies that I keep mentioning? Well, here we go. And this diagram was actually taken from the original book by Dylan, Wiliam and Siobhan Leahy. And I really like the diagram because we've got the strategies, we've got the people involved, as I've said, the teacher, peer and learner. We've got the areas to focus on, where the learner is going. So that is where we start with our planning and clarifying, sharing and understanding learning intentions, the first strategy. Then during the learning process, we'll be asking, where is the learner now at this point? And that's where we need to be able to answer that. We need to elicit evidence of learning, and there's lots of ways we can do that. In order to get them to their final destination, we need to be able to provide feedback to help them get there, and that's teacher feedback. But we can also have peer support, peer critique, students supporting each other as learning resources. And then finally, and this is regarded as perhaps the most important, although they are all of importance and value and they are all connected, but it's when students take ownership of their own learning and they understand what they're learning and where they're at and how they can get to where they need to be and how they can improve. So that is a really good overview of what the 5 strategies are. This is the original book that I've based my work on, Embedding Formative Assessment. You do not need to have read this book to be able to access my book, although it is a really good read. Of course, I would say that. And this is what Dylan and Siobhan have to say about the first formative assessment strategy. So this naturally is our starting point. About students and teachers really need to know where the learner is going, and that needs to be very clear so that everyone can get to where they need to be. And this is why I mentioned long-term curriculum planning and short-term planning are linked. Now, I'm using the term learning intentions. That's the term, the phrase, however you want to say, that Wiliam Leahy and Siobhan Leahy write about. Many schools will use lesson objective, lesson aim, and that, of course, is absolutely fine. And Bruce Robertson writes a really good point about this in The Teacher Delusion 3. He likes to use different lesson objectives, aims, outcomes, because he likes the class to be clear about what they need to do that lesson. So, and he makes a really good point. I thought that was really interesting. The issue with, which Bruce is aware of, I'm aware of, other people, many people are aware of this, the issue with the lesson objective is that we were trying to confine something to within a space of a lesson, and then next lesson we had to have another lesson objective, whereas we know learning doesn't take place in one lesson, learning takes time. And also, can we say exactly how long it will take for a child and a whole class to learn something? We can plan and we can have guidance, but learning takes as long as it needs to take. So we have to think about our long-term curriculum plan. I have designed curriculums from Key Stage 2, 3, 4, and 5. And the way I do that with different key stages are very different. Naturally, with GCSE and A-level, there is a time we have a specific amount of exam content that we have to teach. We have our specification, and then we can break it down into the short-term lesson planning and delivery. Whereas with Key Stage 2 and 3, I did prefer the elements of flexibility, of course. That's absolutely fantastic. So this is where we do really need to think about learning intentions long-term and then short-term in the lesson. I'll give you a moment to read this. This is my 3 pieces of advice about sharing learning intentions with students. Now, this might seem obvious, common sense advice, but I have made mistakes with learning intentions. I have seen learning intentions shared online and in other classrooms that don't always match this criteria. So I'll just talk you through each one of them. So the first point is about learning intentions being crystal clear, that every single member of the class fully understands the learning intention. So it's one thing just putting the learning intention up on the board, but we really should talk about it, perhaps ask some questions, check for understanding. Also, if there's complex vocabulary, tier 3 subject-specific vocabulary, it may be worth revisiting or doing a retrieval task to check if students can recall from long-term memory the terminology that you're including. Also, with exam classes, it can be tempting to use the language in the specification and the assessment objectives, but again, we need to make sure that students actually understand that. And we shouldn't be differentiating the learning intentions. So it was quite popular a few years ago to see some, most, all, and must, should, could. And I remember a trainee that I was working with and supporting came from university and told me that that's what they were doing and they should do. And I remember watching the lesson and having a problem with that, and not with the trainee, because that's what she'd been told at university. And this, by the way, years ago when I was back in the UK. Yes, and it really was putting a limit on expectations for some, giving some a chance to opt out, only challenging some people in the class. And that links in with desirable difficulties. Actually, the level of challenge provided should be desirably difficult for all. We can differentiate the different levels of support and challenge we give with success criteria and with resources in the classroom. I'm not advocating different coloured worksheets, but the learning intentions is not where we differentiate. And another point about the learning intentions being very clear and specific, but they should only be specific to a point. So they should be specific that everyone understands because the language is clear. And in terms of the content, everyone knows what needs to be learned and how. The how can also be supported by the success criteria. But the example that I give in the book, and this is from the advice of Shirley Clarke, is about removing the context. So the example was, imagine instructing a class, their learning intention is to be able to write a clear step-by-step set of instructions. And we're going to use the example of making a lasagna from scratch. Now we're going to leave the lasagna out of the learning intentions because the focus is on the step-by-step instructions. And then later we could replace the lasagna with something else. It wouldn't even actually need to be a food, a cooking context. So we're removing that out of the learning intention to make it more transferable. Another point I want to make about learning intentions. So as I said, learning happens over time. Do you revisit learning intentions? So I have always used lesson objectives, learning intentions, although I've done things in the past, make students copy them out, lots of things where not being the most effective. But I always just thought it was to just explain what we're doing in the lesson. And actually now I see learning intentions very differently. And the work of Professors Robert and Elizabeth Bjork, who coined the term desirable difficulties, have also wrote about the difference between performance and learning. So if we have a learning intention in the lesson and we're delivering new content, we could be asking questions, we can check for understanding, but we won't know if students have learned that unless we revisit it at a later date. There's been lots of quotes about learning being a change in long-term memory or a change in long-term capability. So what I've done now in history, we use big questions as the learning intention. So I've taken the big questions and I put them into a grid that I used later. And I used this one actually a few weeks later. I think it might have been 2 or 3, because this was also linking in with what I was teaching about. This was obviously about Nazi Germany. So the class had seen these big questions before, had they been the learning intentions to focus previously, but now I wanted to see what could they recall from their long-term memory about the previous learning intention. And this was really good. This has been really helpful for me, a very simple way, just taking previous learning intentions and actually using them for retrieval tasks after I've allowed some forgetting to take place, not too long. That's the key. We don't want it to be too long that they've completely forgotten and then they're lacking in confidence, and then using it for retrieval practice. Another really valid point that Shirley Clarke makes, that is something that I explore a lot in the book, is about, well, I refer to it as lethal mutations. That's not my quote, by the way, that's Ed Hurtle, but misinterpreted, misunderstood, mistakes made, well-intentioned. These things, I'm not quite sure how they've happened, school policies. But I think it's really important that we reflect on the mutations, we discuss them, and we prevent them or stop them from happening. So when I said that I was writing a chapter about learning intentions, some of the feedback from teachers was very negative, saying, oh, they're an absolute waste of time, but I have to do them because my school make me. And I'm trying to convince people who think that no, they're not a waste of time. They can be if they are lethally mutated. So some of the ways that can happen with learning intentions, probably the most common one that I still see a lot, this is still happening, is copying learning intentions down. Why is this happening? Absolute waste of time. It could take some children quite a while to copy this down. And just because they've copied it down, what does that mean? Does that mean they've understood it? No, of course it doesn't. And this is the question we need to keep coming back to. Does it help learning? And if it doesn't, why are we doing this? I observed a lesson where the teacher said, oh, don't worry, we don't copy down and write down lesson objectives in this classroom. we glue them in. And they weren't joking. I was really shocked by this. And actually, that took just as long because they had to cut it out and then stick it in, which again, I didn't think was a great use of time. So that's definitely something, if you're doing, and if your school are encouraging this, I know it's difficult, but try and have that conversation and say that there is another and a better way. Also, about this discussion of the restricting it to one lesson. Oh, quick, hurry up, we've got to get through this content because next lesson, and sometimes actually we do have things we have to stick to, especially with exam content. We might not be able to have as much time as we would like, but we shouldn't let learning intentions restrict us and be rigid. They really do need to have an element of flexibility. Now, this is something that Dylan, Wiliam and Siobhan Leahy have written about. I've included in my book, and I really like what they had to say. They said, you don't have to use it at the start of a lesson. And it makes sense, really. There's so many reasons why we don't have to use it at the start of a lesson. For example, when students come in, they may have work that they need to finish off. So why would we explain a learning intention and then go back and do something and then go, right, we're going back to that learning intention I told you about? No, that's not very helpful. So that might be the learning intention explained in the middle of the lesson. And also Dylan, Wiliam and Siobhan Leahy say, it can actually be really boring starting the lesson that way every single lesson. And sometimes it spoils the element of curiosity about learning about something new. So yeah, we just have to use our professional judgment as to when we share the learning intentions with our class. So this is Dylan, Wiliam and Siobhan Leahy explaining the difference between learning intentions and success criteria. And here's my advice. So the success criteria are the learning intentions broken down. It's very difficult with learning intentions to write an objective intention that is quite concise and clear because there's a lot to get in, but actually don't worry, we do have the success criteria to help us with that. And the success criteria should focus on the steps in the process, what students need to do, how they can do that. And again, students really should understand, and I know that is obvious, but there are lots of examples where students, and I say examples, I'm referring to myself most of the time, where students are given success criteria and they stick it in their book and they don't refer back to it, they don't use it. And it's just there, just in case, and some might and some might not. So I think success criteria can be used really well, but it's not always easy to do. And that's why I say this, we really do need to support newly qualified teachers, early careers teachers with success criteria. I was observed quite early in my career and asked where the success criteria was. And I hadn't been trained or didn't really know anything about that and didn't really know how to write success criteria. I ended up just writing bullet point lists that weren't that helpful. So I definitely think we should share success criteria, collaborate, have conversations, look at the examples that are out there, reflect and review. Are they helping the students in your class? If they're helping some but not all, why is that the case? Do they need to be adapted slightly? So Dylan Wiliam made the point that this is probably, I think he did say that this is the most difficult strand out of the 5, and I agree. So to write learning intentions that are very helpful, clear, specific, desirably difficult, and to have very helpful success criteria isn't always as easy as we think. But of course, it is possible, and the more we work together, the easier it will be. So as I've said, they have the potential to hinder if they become mutated and waste time, which we don't want. They should always be clear, specific, desirably difficult, communicated clearly, differentiate success criteria, not learning intentions. So moving on to the second strand, this is what Dylan and Siobhan had to say. So the second strategy of formative assessment is about activities and discussions that elicit evidence of learning. And Wiliam and Siobhan Leahy say that the best way to do this is by talking to the children. We can't see what is in their brains. We're not mind readers. We can have lots of conversations. And there's lots of ways that we can elicit this evidence in the classroom. Questioning techniques, which I write about, which Doug Lamov has written a lot about. And questioning is gaining much more of a profile in education, which it should. I remember as an NQT, I had feedback that was helpful, that said I needed to develop my questioning techniques, because I was observed teaching an A-level politics lesson and it was all hands up and it was the same two people answering every time. And I knew that feedback was coming, but I didn't really know what to do. I did say, oh, how can I improve my questioning? And I actually was sent to another school for the day to shadow a teacher who had a reputation in the area for fantastic questioning techniques. And that was really helpful. And other than the cost of supply, that was a low-cost, high-impact form of professional development. Mini whiteboards, great, very simple, easy to use. But again, there are ways to make them more effective. Statements that prompt thinking and discussion within subjects and topics. Retrieval practice, I've written a lot about this. Elaboration, asking students to extend and take it further, stretch it out, see how much they know and can recall. And exit tickets, there's a fantastic case study by Jason Carhall in my book. He's a primary school teacher, there's primary school case studies and secondary, and he writes about how he uses exit tickets. So the issue with what Dylan and Siobhan call no hands up except to ask a question. Well, actually, I say the issue. There's lots of issues, isn't there? First of all, if we ask this, then the students with their hands up, if they're volunteering, then it's likely that they do know. But what about everybody else in the class? And considering there's so many problems with it, some people might lack confidence to put their hands up. Some students might say, oh, I can count on Kate to put her hand up, she always does, so I can just sit back and relax. They don't feel any accountability. They don't get involved. So despite all of these issues, is still a universal classroom strategy. And I've known the problems about about hands up strategies, but I've still gone back to it. So it is very difficult, but there are definitely ways that we can overcome this, and there are great strategies and techniques. Probably the most famous is associated with Doug Lamov with cold calling, which is asking questions in class that is no hands up. Okay, again, these strategies and techniques that sound simple, there's a lot more to it, but they are effective. And when I was reflecting about how I use cold calling in the classroom, these were my tips that I wrote about. So I'll just very quickly go through them. Now, the first point is about knowing and using student names, because otherwise you don't want to go you at the back. No, that's not very personal. The problem that we have with that is that for some teachers, perhaps if you're a secondary teacher and you see a class, some subjects, it may be once or twice a week, it can be very difficult learning students' names. Seating plans can help. If you have a seating plan in front of you, you can just look down and then use their name. At the start of term, I get my students to wear a sticky label with their name, and then that helps me learn their name, because I'm using cold calling. I'm either using my seating plan or the sticky label, and I'm using their names more. So therefore I'm becoming more familiar with their names. So that's a really personal element of it. And this is another important point about asking another question. So if you've asked a student during cold calling a question, then perhaps ask them again later, because what we don't want students to think is, I've answered my question, I'm done, I can switch off, chill out. It's about that whole class accountability. But this has been misunderstood as well. And I sent my cold calling tips to Doug Lamov, and the thing he said he really liked was the positivity and the warmth. It's not about trunchbull style, what is your answer, and putting children on the spot and making them feel pressure. Absolutely not. It is about including everyone, having an inclusive classroom, creating a culture where if they don't answer it correctly, it's not humiliating. So yes, lots of positive emphasis and praise. And it doesn't even have to be a question. It could be, I'm interested to hear what you think about that. And would you like to add anything to their answer? The other thing is about make time for wait time. So I've been terrible at this in the past. I just need to be quiet. But what we need to do is ask the question, then have the wait time, then select the student so that everyone is thinking. And during that time, they're all thinking because anyone could be asked. But if we ask the question and we ask the question, we go, Tom, then we have the wait time. Well, where's everyone else? They might have, they don't need to answer that question. Tom's answering it. So it's very important that we're careful about the wait time. We provide enough time and when we provide the wait time. And the more that we make it the norm in the classroom, this is the same with retrieval practice, the more low stakes it becomes. And it just is part of a classroom routine. Now, this is what's helped me observe others. Actually, I've observed a lot of teachers online. So if you just go on YouTube or the Teach Like a Champion website, there's lots of videos of teachers who are very confident and experienced with cold calling. And I found that very helpful. And cold calling, when we were online for a year, well, we were all on Zoom. It was much easier with student names because their names were written on the box right in front of me. So that was helpful. And it still worked really well because initially when we were online, it was tough. Very quiet, very reluctant to engage. So hopefully we won't go back to online learning again. But if we were, it's definitely a technique to use. And also this one, so I've observed others, but ask someone to give you feedback, to watch you with your cold calling, because there are things that we perhaps might not be aware of, that we are possibly targeting people that students in the class we think might know. We're not given as much wait time as we think, or maybe our questions that we're asking aren't clear, specific, and desirably difficult. So hopefully you find those top tips helpful. And here's some more tips. So this is a really important aspect. It's at the heart of teaching and learning, eliciting evidence of what students know, but also finding out what they don't know. And that's not a bad thing, because when we know and students know what they don't know yet, then we can focus on closing those knowledge gaps. So no hands up except to ask a question is a really good approach and something that we should work on and reflect on. And retrieval practice is obviously a great way to elicit evidence of learning, of long-term learning as well. So lots of different ways that we can do that. But the key with retrieval practice is to involve everyone in the class. So if I was to ask a retrieval question, I had hands up, Ben has his hand up. Ben, what's the answer? Correct, let's move on. Could everyone in the class recall that information? Did everybody know that? Well, no, Ben's just done the retrieval effort for everybody else, and I cannot guarantee that everyone in the class knew that, but yeah, I've moved on and assumed that. So lots for us to think about there. Right, the third strategy, formative assessment. This is something that Dylan William and John Hattie have written a lot about, and that is feedback. I'll give you a moment to read my 3 golden rules. First point, again, very important, might seem obvious, but do students actually understand the feedback? Do they understand what they need to do to improve? I remember we had a big focus on literacy and literacy feedback in my school in Wales. I loved that, and actually over the years I was there, the 6 years I was there, it was incredible. The impact was visible with literacy. And even though we were always having a literacy focus, I remember giving some feedback about homophones. So using the correct there. And again, the curse of knowledge. I thought because I talked about homophones before, that the student would understand that. They had no idea what I was on about. And I made an assumption. They didn't understand it. So therefore they made the same mistake again. It has to be helpful. And I'm going to share the work of Ron Berger, who promotes giving feedback that is kind, specific, and helpful. He said, if it's not helpful, then it's absolute waste of time, isn't it? So obviously that's at the heart of feedback, that it helps students. And then again, this is what Dylan William, Michael Childs, John Hattie, Shirley Clark, people who writing about feedback have said, yeah, but what are the students doing with that feedback? How are they acting on that? So if I think about Dylan William giving me feedback with my chapters in the book, of course I acted on it. It wasn't just like, oh, thanks, that's great. I absolutely acted on the feedback that he gave me, that I understood, and that was very helpful. And then it greatly improved the piece of writing afterwards. So those are 3 things to keep in mind when we are providing feedback for students. I love this from Dylan William. Originally, this is from the book, What Does This Look Like in the Classroom? By Carl Hendrick and Robin McPherson, published in 2017. Really, really great book. And there's a chapter about assessment and feedback with Daisy Christodoulou and Dylan William. So this is his 4 quarters marking policy that he writes about. And it's not prescriptive, saying when you should mark in detail, when you should skim another, because that's up for teachers and departments and schools to decide. But we shouldn't be marking everything in detail. It's not a good use of our time. It's not effective. Think about the workload issues. In my subject, in history, A-level is a great example. Essays and assignments are marked thoroughly in detail, but other classwork will be skimmed. A retrieval practice task could be self or peer assessed, or even marked by technology. If it's a quiz like Kahoot, it will mark it for you. So it is about thinking, where does this apply within your subject and within your context? However, the key points about self and peer assessment, which are the next 2 strategies, is this monitoring and the guidance. And it's not easy for students to self and peer assess. We really need to help them with that. I do think that is a fantastic model. So this is just another point to emphasize, that it's what the students do with that feedback that really matters. Now, the EEF recently, a few months ago, have published a guidance report about feedback. Dylan William was involved in this. There's a lot about formative assessment. You can download this freely on the EEF website, and it certainly is worth reading. And this is just a summary. I won't go through this. I just wanted to signpost you to that. So the 4th strategy, activating students as learning resources for one another. Yes, I think this is underused, underestimated, underrated, lots and lots of potential in the classroom, although people probably can see potential for some problems in the classroom and issues with behaviour. So there's been a lot written about group work and peer collaboration, that students will use it as an excuse to chat to each other. They become distracted. Someone in the group might do all the work on behalf of everybody else. All of these issues I am aware of and I've experienced myself, but there are ways to overcome this. And then there are a range of benefits that come from peer collaboration, support, assessment and critique. So it's not about competition, it is about collaboration in the classroom. Again, I'll give you a moment to read the quote from Dylan and Siobhan. really good point that they make about group goals and individual accountability so that nobody can slack off. And again, everyone within the group needs to fully understand their role and what they need to do, how they can contribute. So that is really worth keeping in mind and persevering with. So here's an example of kind, specific, and helpful peer critique. I interviewed Ron Berger this week on Teachers Talk Radio. If you missed it, you can listen to it for free as a podcast on any podcast provider. Teachers Talk Radio, Kate Jones, Ron Berger. It was amazing. And I asked him all about his mantra, what he's become known for, kind, specific, and helpful. If you haven't seen the short video, Austin's Butterfly, please watch it. It's inspiring, it's heartwarming, and share it with your colleagues, share it with your students. This is an example from a Year 7 class that were writing an extended piece about the Battle of Hastings, and they were using peer critique and feedback. And what I used to do would be wait until the extended piece of writing was completed and then ask students to peer critique. But actually that seems more in line with summative rather than formative assessment. So now what I do with extended writing and peer critique is they do so after each paragraph, and they can see immediately the benefits and the impact of peer critique. So if we take this example, I really like this specific example. The feedback, you spelled Hastings wrong. Okay, the next paragraph and the rest of the essay, they can spell Hastings correctly. This is about the Battle of Hastings. They may have used that word 25 times, but they've only spelt it incorrectly in the first paragraph because it was identified early on. And we've used SP, which was our literacy code. This student wrote it out correctly to help their peer. I don't say to my students that they must put EBI, WWW. That's, for me, that's not how they communicate. As long as it's kind, specific, and helpful, I don't mind. So this student came up with this, the color code, good, fix it. And it just made me laugh because it's simple, it's to the point. I think it fits in with the kind, specific, and helpful. It could be more helpful, more specific, but they gave some peer critique, add more detail. And we can already see the second paragraph is more detailed. And they've used the wrong homophone there, and the peer has picked that up. And this was the lesson where students were saying, I'm done. Can you check mine now? Wait till I finish my paragraph. It was amazing. As a teacher, I could step back, oversee and monitor this peer critique, and it was kind, it was specific, and the students realized how helpful it was. Ethic of Excellence is such a superb book. There's going to be an in-action book about it. I love this book so much. I'm a huge fan of Ron Berger, and it is about creating this culture of craftsmanship with students. So please do check it out if you haven't already. And building on this, this is by Jamie Clark, a word diagram to support students. Well, how do I be kind, specific, and helpful? Here are examples and sentence starters. And the reason why kind, specific, and helpful are so important, students need to be reminded because they're not always kind to each other. I've heard comments, I can't read your handwriting, it's awful, or this is okay, and things like that could be quite hurtful. And we wouldn't say that as a teacher, and students shouldn't say that to each other. When I spoke to Ron Berger, he also said that there's very subtle and kind things that students do, rolling their eyes or being sarcastic, going, yeah, well done. So really emphasize the importance of kindness. Being very specific, instead of just saying spellings, that student actually circled and put SP. I used to previously put take care of punctuation. That's not specific. I should have said exactly, don't forget to put full sentences or full stops at the end of sentences. That is very specific. The more specific it will be, the more helpful it will be. And you can download this online, and I will share this, it's on Twitter. So my tips, I've got some great case studies in the book. Only use with formative assessment, not summative assessment. Dylan William has a very strong stance on this. rightly so. Students should not be giving each other any type of formal grading. It's to help each other learn and progress. The group goals, individual accountability, incredibly important. Collaboration, cooperation, keep it positive, avoid competition. Kind, specific and helpful, make it your mantra in your classroom. And really promote these opportunities for discussion. It might not always be peer critique. That's just one example. My book talks about more, but there's lots of ways that we can do this. Okay, the final strategy in the 5 formative assessment strategies is activating students as owners of their own learning. And this is a quote from my book. I said it was the Holy Grail. John Hattie picked up on this and said I found what Monty Python and he was searching for but never did find. It's just my opinion, but I do think it is incredibly important, and Dylan Wiliam and Siobhan Leahy say similar. There's been misconceptions about this, and there are ways that independent learning has taken place that are not a good example of this strategy. Something could be a research task, saying to the class, okay, on your devices, I would like you to find out as much as you can about Henry VIII. Off we go. That's not a good idea to do. That's lacking support, guidance. Each member of the class could come back with something different. That's not effective. I really don't like seeing that. And whilst I'm not saying that students shouldn't research and find information out, but actually that's the type of teaching that has the reputation as lazy teaching and isn't effective. But that's not what I'm writing about, or what Dylan and Siobhan were writing about as well. It actually takes a lot of time, hard work, effort, investment from the teacher and the student to get this right. But when they do, this is why it's a holy grail. When a student can look at their work, seek feedback, embrace feedback, improve it, they become aware of how they can check and improve their work, then they will make so much progress and they will flourish. So this is what Dylan and Siobhan had to say. All 4 strategies leading up to this point. So again, stressing the importance of it. So here's just some examples from my classroom. I created a read, reflect, check and correct mat. This could be on the board. It could be in books. I like the idea of it in books. I've done that because then students refer to it if students finish at different points. I saw a primary school that had a laminated copy on each table. So there's different ways you can go about this. And before any work was submitted or completed, they had to go through, and this was Key Stage 3, but I still made some older students do this as well. They had to check all of these things. And this came out of slight frustration from me, actually, because students were submitting work that they didn't always use capital letters correctly, although they know they should. They forgot the full stops. They weren't using paragraphs. So instead of me giving that feedback, writing it in red pen, they were able to go through, check, and self-correct. And then when we went online and students were submitting work, I was experiencing similar issues. That work was being turned in that wasn't completed. There was some issues with literacy and lacking detail. And there are lots of other methods and techniques and resources in the book that I explore this. I'm just trying to emphasize the point about how we can support students to become independent learners. To actually become independent learners, they don't do that independently, ironically. So all the other strategies will fall into place. So they have to know what they need to learn, how they can get there. They've have to have listened to teacher and peer feedback and know exactly what they need to do to improve their work and to make progress. And I wanted to finish with this quote from Shirley Clark. Nothing in education is a quick fix. There's nuance, there's differences, there's variables. everything takes careful thought, consideration, reflection, discussion, and that certainly applies with formative assessment. And I hope my book actually sparks conversations with leaders and teachers in schools. I hope it's very helpful to new teachers to the profession as well, experienced teachers, with tips and takeaways, advice for leaders. It's a small book, but I think there's a lot in it. Don't just take my word for it. John Hattie wrote some very lovely, kind things about it. So if you do want to find out more, if you found this interesting, then my book is published next month. And do connect with me on social media. I'm very active on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I'm also on LinkedIn. I have a website, lovetoteach87.com. I haven't blogged anything about formative assessment. I've blogged about retrieval practice. So I've blogged about aspects of formative assessment, but all the reading and the writing that I've done, I've put into this book, and that's why I wanted to just talk about them as well. I've been sharing snippets on Twitter, but it's quite hard to explain without the context, and the book goes in even more depth. Hope you find that helpful. I hope you enjoy back to school. It's an exciting time, it really is. And if it's not an exciting time for you, if you're nervous or worried, that is also normal. I've been there as well. And I'm so excited to see students and colleagues, but with everything that has happened with the pandemic, I'm still nervous and apprehensive as well. So if you're on holiday, enjoy the rest of the holiday. And as I've said, stay in touch and connected with me. Thank you.